My name is Naomi Allen, and I want to welcome you on behalf of Brooklyn for Peace. First of all, some housekeeping business. There are bathrooms over there, and there's a bathroom at the exit. We have a terrific program ahead of us tonight. We're going to be talking about the Palestinian right of return. And this is a subject that is not much understood in mainstream circles. After our speakers, we're going to have an open Q&A and discussion period. You do not have to ask a question. You're free to make a statement or say whatever you like, as long as you keep it short. And now I want to turn the meeting over to our moderator, Riham Barghouti, who's a Palestinian American activist who lived in the occupied Palestinian territories for 10 years. She currently resides in New York City, where she works as a teacher. Riham is a founding member of Adalah-NY, the New York campaign for the boycott of Israel, and of PACB, the Palestinian campaign for the academic and cultural boycott of Israel. Riham.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Brooklyn for Peace, for inviting me this evening and organizing this really amazing event. Thank you all for coming out. I'm glad it's not raining. I'm really honored to be sitting among these three individuals who I consider very good friends, but more importantly, who have such a deep and unwavering commitment to social justice. Jamil Dakwar, Donna, Nevel, and Bina Ahmad. So we're here tonight to explore what is arguably the most contentious, but undeniably the most significant aspect of the Palestinian struggle for liberation and self-determination. The right of Palestinian refugees to return to their homes and lands in historic Palestine. In 1948, over 750,000 out of the 1.4 million Palestinians that were living in 1,300 towns and villages were driven out of their homeland in what is present-day Israel to the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, neighboring Arab countries, and the remaining countries of the world. That constituted 80% of the indigenous population of Palestine. Palestinian Muslims and Christians that were forcibly expelled from their homes. Their lands were confiscated, their homes and their villages were destroyed in order to establish a Jewish majority state in their ancestral homeland. In addition, thousands of Palestinians were displaced from their homes, but they stayed within the newly declared State of Israel. And according to documented data, Israel controlled some 774 towns and villages and had destroyed 531 Palestinian towns and villages. The atrocities of the Israeli forces also included more than 70 massacres during this period, in which 15,000 Palestinians were killed. This is why Palestinians call this Nakba, the catastrophe. This year, 2018, as Israel celebrates its 70th anniversary, Palestinians mark the 70 years of a Nakba that began in 1948 but continues today. Currently, more than half of the Palestinian people live as refugees. They number about 7 million of 13 million Palestinians worldwide. And they still hold on to their keys of their homes and refuse, even now, 70 years later, to leave those refugee camps because they are determined to return. The right of refugees to return to their homes is an inalienable right. It's a universal right. It's a right that cannot be negotiated away or done away with for pragmatic reasons. And it is also what is just, and it's a basic prerequisite for Palestinians to find freedom, justice, and equality. So our three speakers tonight will further explore this topic of Palestinian refugees' right to their return to their homes. And I'm honored to present them now. Jamil Dakwar is the director of the American Civil Liberties Union Human Rights Program. He worked at Human Rights Watch, where he conducted research, engaged in advocacy, and published reports on issues of torture and detention in Egypt, Morocco, Israel, and the occupied Palestinian territory. He was also a senior attorney with Adalah, the Legal Center for Arab Minority Rights in Israel, where he filed and argued human rights cases before Israeli courts and advocated before international forums. He's a graduate of Tel Aviv University and New York University School of Law, and an adjunct professor at John Jay College of Criminal Justice and Hunter College, CUNY. And he'll be speaking in his personal capacity, not as an ACLU staff member. Donna Nevel is a community psychologist and educator, is a co-director of Parcio, a participatory action research center. She's the founding member of the Facing the Nakba project, Jews Say No, and Jews Against Anti-Muslim Racism. She was a co-founder of Jews for Racial and Economic Justice and the Center for Immigrant Families. And Bina Ahmad is a social justice attorney who has worked with numerous animal rights and human rights organizations. She worked and lived in Palestine. She worked in Al-Haq, where she served on the legal team for the Russell Tribunal in Palestine. She was a legal consultant to Badil Resource Center for Palestinian Residency and Refugee Rights, as well as the Norwegian Refugee Council's Palestine Division. She currently serves on the steering committee of the U.S. Campaign for Palestinian Rights, as well as the advisory board of the Food Empowerment Project and the advisory board of the Animal Rights Activism Committee, an activist group of lawyers and legal workers she co-founded. She conducts Know Your Rights trainings, of which I attended and are excellent, for radical left movements and state-targeted communities. And she currently works as a public defender in New York. Please welcome our speakers for this evening.
Thank you very much, Riham, for the very kind introduction and for your activism and dedication to Palestinian rights issues while working as a dedicated teacher. I know that many of you have the same responsibilities and commitments, and we really appreciate you all coming tonight to talk about this very important issue. And I'm also honored to share the panel with Bina and Donna. In fact, I met Donna first time when we shared a panel on the Goldstone report years ago, and we became very close friends since then. And Bina through her work, both here and when she was in Palestine during very tough time. So I'm really honored to be here and to talk to you about this issue. As Riham mentioned, I'm a Palestinian myself, and I now live in New York, and I was born and raised in Haifa. So I'm one of those Palestinians who their parents or families were lucky enough, fortunate enough to survive the 1948 Nakba and the war and stayed inside Palestine. And one of the 175,000 Palestinians who became formal citizens of Israel, and now number around 1.4 or 1.5 million people. So I will be also speaking from that perspective, maybe in the Q&A. I was asked to speak specifically about the legal rights of refugees, particularly under international law, and as well as connecting it to what's happening now in Gaza, particularly around the Great March of Return, which I'm sure all of you have been following with deep sorrow for the fact that how this movement, the largely peaceful movement of people really seeking return, is being crushed by deadly force on a weekly basis, and we'll talk more about that. So let me just start with more the dry part of what is the right of return or the right to return under international law, and I will go quickly through it. Some of you already know this stuff, but it's really important to talk about the foundations of the right to return. It is really rooted in the international human rights law, international humanitarian law, and international refugee law. These are three different sources of international law. So when we talk about human rights law, it's the laws, the treaties that were adopted by the United Nations, ratified by many countries, particularly after World War II. In fact, the right of return, or right to return, was really a foundational right as part of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which we will be celebrating the 70th anniversary this coming December. And around the same time, the Palestinians really became displaced and refugees, as Riham mentioned, 80% of the historic Palestinian indigenous community. So when we talk about the right of return, it really comes from the notion of, and the lessons really learned from the horrors of World War II and from the horrors of the Holocaust. That is, refugees during that period of time were really in need of not only safe haven, but also a call for protection and repatriation, return to their homes and lands. So from that perspective, the humanity, the global community came together and said, as part of the understanding of how do we protect humanity, the right to return should be a fundamental right, an inherent right that every human being should have the right. And specifically in Article 13 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, it says everyone has the right to leave any country, including his own, and return to his country. So that's the kind of first foundation. And then this right to return was developed under another important treaty that is called International Civil and Political Rights, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which was adopted in 1966. Many countries, including the United States, including Israel, ratified those treaties. Israel, for example, ratified it in 1991. The United States ratified it only in 1992. But in this treaty, we have another affirmation of the right to return. And it's clear in Article 12.4 that says no one shall be arbitrarily deprived of the right to enter his own country. Now here, what's important about this is that there are no restrictions that could be placed on this right. No restrictions in the name of national security, public order, or safety. These are some of the restrictions or some of the excuses or justifications that countries sometimes use or invoke in order to restrict rights. And they are actually sometimes in the treaties. But in this particular provision, when it comes to the return to your home country, there's no restriction. The only restriction is that it could be suspended during a time of emergency. That is, in a time of war, you may not be able to uphold the right of a person to return, so you can suspend that. But that has to be done within very strict circumstances. For example, the emergency situation should amount to a threat to the existence of the nation. Not just any kind of threat. It's not like a passing storm that will make you keep leave away or keep out people from returning, refugees. In Israel, for example, asserted that it's in an emergency situation since 1948 to this day, and every year the Knesset has to renew the state of emergency, which allows the government to use all kinds of emergency situations, which you over here, for example, hear about this only when a time of catastrophes and hurricanes, stuff like that. But in Israel, it is a permanent state of emergency, which in a legal sense, again, from the perspective of Israeli legal point of view, allows them to take measures that would, for example, restrict and prevent people from returning to their home countries. Now, the right to return from an Israeli perspective has always been seen as a major way of preventing Palestinians, not just from returning to their homes, but from their ability to be able to take back their properties, to be back to their communities. As Riham mentioned, over 450 towns and villages were destroyed. We'll talk more about some of those horrific details. But the most important thing to remember is that when it comes to the right of return, it is not just like some sort of an abstract issue. It's for people. It's like a whole living experience. It's that you are basically rooted out of your community, and you are told because of your being a Palestinian, whether you're Palestinian Christian or Palestinian Muslim in this case, you're not allowed to return back. While in the case of Israeli Jews, even if you have no connection to the place, if you lived in Moldova all your life or your time, you can actually exercise what Israel calls the right under the law of return, to be able to come and become a full Israeli citizen, while Palestinian refugees are denied their very basic right to return home. We're not talking about citizenship, because under international law, there is no right to acquire citizenship. There's a right of return. What happens after that is something that obviously will be part of what countries have obligations to treat everyone equally and so on. And then from there, there's a discussion about what should really happen. Maybe we'll have more about that. But the most important thing that happened right after the Nakba was that the international community was very clear that that was a violation of all the rules, of all the customs that were at least understood at the time. And therefore, in 1948, in December of 1948, the General Assembly of the United Nations, which is meeting here in New York this year, it passed important resolution 194, which affirmed the right of return with no equivocation, no conditions whatsoever. And it says, and it's really important to quote that resolution, because really it's the foundational resolution for the right of return movement and for all refugees. And it says, in a provision 11 of that resolution, the United Nations General Assembly resolves that the refugees wishing to return to their homes and live at peace with their neighbors should be permitted to do so at the earliest practicable date, and that compensation should be paid for the property of those choosing not to return, and for loss of or damage to property which under principles of international law or in equity should be made good by the governments of authorities responsible. So here are the very important notion of affirming the right of return. It should not be diminished by the fact that if you get a compensation, you're not allowed to return. No, it is about affirming both rights. You be restituted and repatriated, and then, or you could choose. And that's actually one of the things that have developed over the years. For example, the High Commissioner for Refugees, which was established also around the same time, given the crisis of refugees in Europe during that time, and the fact that the United Nations was facing this crisis, upheld these rules and these conditions. There are three things that you have to provide to refugees as choices. One is repatriation, and voluntary repatriation is the more preferred and favored one. The second is staying where they are. Some of the refugees, for example, stayed after the war, World War II, moved to a country and they stayed in that country. France, for example, or in Netherlands, or in the UK. They stayed there. If they can stay there, that's fine. The third option is resettlement, something that we talked about a lot here under Trump, where this country now, for example, Trump slashed the number of refugees that can be resettled in the United States to 30,000, which is the lowest number that we've had since we ratified the refugee protocol in 1980. So those are the three choices. And those are not diminished. You can choose. The refugee will have to choose. So moving quickly to what does that really mean for the Palestinians. So the Palestinians, very, very beginning, said, well, we are displaced people. We are people that are, most of our communities are outside our homeland, and we wish to return. Israel closed the borders after 1948, after the ceasefire agreement that was reached in 1949, and basically made it clear that anyone who dares to return, who crosses the border, will be shot at and killed. And between 1947 and 48 till the early 1950s, there were thousands of Palestinians who were trying to come back from Jordan, from Lebanon, refugee camps, and who tried to sneak in back to their homes and to their communities. Many families were separated. Again, thinking about those family separations that we're all outraged about. This is the kind of thing that happened on a horrific numbers, right? My family, my mother's aunt was separated. She left to Lebanon. She was never able to come back. She died a few years ago in Lebanon. Was never able to return, even though she was living just blocks away from the rest of her family. And so all of that stuff happened while Israel, by force, said, we will not allow any Palestinians to come back. because we have, and that is in a situation where we know, now historically know, that was after a very planned decision and premeditated decision of the Zionist forces led by the Haganah and Ben-Gurion, who was leading the Haganah, to make sure that we keep, we deport as many Palestinians, we destroy their property, we do not allow them to come back. And in the situations where you find that certain Palestinian communities remained, like for example in Nazareth, if you go back to the history of Nazareth, where my wife comes from, there was a decision to deport them, by force, but at some point there was a disagreement within the Zionist forces, and then there was the consideration: what do we do if we deport this largely Palestinian Christian community? We would have a terrible way of explaining that to the Western world, particularly because Nazareth is one of the three most important cities in the Holy Land, right? So there was a decision that, okay, well, let's just keep the community there, and they reached a ceasefire agreement, and basically the Palestinian community in Nazareth surrendered. There was a ceremony even of surrendering the town with little fighting and little casualties. Although there are some who left and couldn't come back, and all these stories are now and more becoming known as people are speaking, because there is a trauma of the Nakba that is, by the way, continuing, including for not my generation, obviously, so we didn't live the Nakba, but my parents and my grandparents that did not really want to talk about this stuff. So the last thing I want to close with is just quickly is about why the Palestinians in Gaza are staging protests on a weekly basis. And we've seen those images, and this is incredible. They've been doing that since March 30th of this year, every Friday. And yet Israel has been saying, no, you can't even get close to the fence. There's no border, by the way, because Israel has never defined its border. You don't even come close to the fence and we will make sure that you get killed. A policy that was approved by the Israeli Supreme Court. I was with a delegation during the time that the Israeli Supreme Court heard arguments or cases, petitions filed by human rights organizations. And it was shocking to see how the government was defending its policy of why we would use live ammunition as a first choice as soon as somebody gets close to 100 meters close to the fence. And they could not really explain it other than to say that we're going to be, there will be like hundreds and thousands of people who will be coming into the country, and what are we going to do next? What are we going to do? We can't allow them to come in, and then there's all the fear-mongering that is parcel of the narrative, that is refugees are coming back home. The same fear-mongering that we're hearing here, we're hearing in Europe, and it's been always against refugees. And we have to really understand why is it where we can understand people saying, well, how can they come and take my home? But the question is really, is that what the Palestinians really want to do? And I think most of the Palestinians who are saying we have the right of return, they understand the reality is that it's not saying that we're gonna, push everybody else to the sea as the propaganda goes. So I think we have to really ensure and affirm the human story of the Palestinian refugees first, that they're supported by legal rights. And the fact that the people in Gaza, most of whom are refugees and live literally miles away from their original towns and villages in the south of Israel, can't even get close to where they used to live, or their fathers and mothers and grandparents used to live. And so we have to see why people are protesting, not just because they want to go and get shot, because they have no hope left. In fact, the numbers that came out just yesterday from the World Bank released a very concerning, troubling report. It says 1.8 million people live in Gaza. Every second person in Gaza is now living in poverty. The youth unemployment has come to 70%, right? 50% of the unemployment rate in general, unemployment in youth, 70%. These are the same youth that some of them are going to protest because there's no hope. What are they going to do? 80% of the population lives in, under humanitarian aid. So with that, I think that what we really need to discuss today is what are the ways forward for the rights of Palestinians to be realized in a way that is consistent with decency and humanity, with international law, with a way that will really be possible for all people, and for really ensuring that there will be the right of return is the foundation for a just peace, which is something that I truly believe in. I think that there's so many solutions been tried and failed. There was one thing that was really never tried, is to really recognize and acknowledge first the right of return. There's no recognition whatsoever. In fact, there's a denying of the Nakba. There's a denying of the right of refugees. And in that sense, it makes things worse for reaching a just solution. So it starts with the recognition and affirming the right, and then we can talk about practical solution of how to make it work so that all people can enjoy equal rights and dignity. Thank you.
Thank you, Naomi, Charlotte, and Brooklyn for Peace for inviting me to join you this evening. I'm particularly pleased to be on the panel together with my dear friends and colleagues, Bina, Jamil, and Riham, for whom I have such admiration and respect. I speak to you this evening from my perspective as a white Jewish woman living in the United States and as a partner to the Palestinian-led movement for justice in Palestine. Last week, during the Jewish holiday of Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, someone I was speaking with said that he never imagined that Israel would end up being as anti-democratic and brutal in its behavior as it is today. We both shook our heads in great dismay. But soon after we commiserated about that, I began to think more deeply about Israel's history and the reality of that history, and how and why we've gotten to the point where we are at today. So my focus this evening in my brief remarks will be on that history and on why I believe those of us in Jewish communities and beyond need to therefore center on the Nakba in our learning if we are to be truly accountable partners to the movement for justice in Palestine. For many of us, myself included, that meant and continues to mean unlearning years of education in which the story of Zionism and of Israel's creation totally ignored the consequences of the people on the people who were living there, that is, the Palestinian people. The Nakba, as we heard this evening, refers to the expulsion of 750,000 Palestinians from their home and land before and during Israel's creation. A Jewish majority state was created in Palestine because the Zionist movement dramatically reduced, through a variety of means, the numbers of Palestinians living there. As Riham made clear, despite propaganda to the contrary, Israel was not a land without a people for a people without a land. And despite other propaganda claiming that Palestinians left on their own accord or because they were instructed to do so by their leaders, of the 530 villages and cities that were destroyed during the Nakba, the majority were a result of military assaults and expulsions by Jewish Zionist forces. A striking example of this was Plan Dalet, launched in March 1948. It laid out a blueprint in great detail for the destruction and forcible depopulation of Palestinian population centers. Included in the text of Plan Dalet, which is available for anyone to see, is the following, and I quote, "In the conquest of villages in your area, you will determine whether to cleanse or destroy them," unquote. So why is it critical for us to understand more about the Nakba and what really happened during those years? Because in my view, with that knowledge and with a deep recognition of how, for example, thriving Palestinian villages were destroyed and replaced with Jewish villages, it is then not complicated at all to understand why Palestinians have the right to the right of return. That is, the right of return wouldn't then be thought of as something Israelis need to give to the Palestinian people as a gift, as a favor, but rather it would be understood as a right that is theirs and to which they are fully entitled. For those of us who are Jewish, we know that Israel claims to speak in our name and in the name of Jews across the globe. I think it's critically important for us to be visible in making clear that this claim is patently false. I also think it's critically important for us to be visible in making very clear that the right of return is a right that is only necessary because of the actions of the Zionist movement and then of Israel from its inception. So while it is true that the current Israeli government is increasingly anti-democratic at best, we have to acknowledge and then reckon with and act upon the knowledge that the origins of the Jewish state were fundamentally rooted in a grave injustice to the Palestinian people. And the Nakba, as we heard tonight, did not have an end. In fact, it continues to this very day with massive land theft and violence toward Palestinians at the hands of the Israeli government and its military, as well as individual acts of violence perpetrated by some Israeli Jewish citizens. That is, and I think it bears repeating, the Nakba, the extreme violence and ethnic cleansing, is not a one-time event, but has characterized Israel's history and continues to characterize its current reality. We all know that liberation at the expense of another people can never lead to true liberation. So what is possible? In addition to many Palestinian organizations focusing on the rights of refugees and other related issues, there is an Israeli Jewish organization called Zochrot, which means remembering in Hebrew. And I quote, "Zochrot promotes acknowledgement and accountability for the ongoing injustices of the Nakba, as well as the reconceptualization of the return as the imperative redress of the Nakba and a chance for a better life for all of the country's inhabitants." Zochrot serves as an inspiration to many of us in U.S. Jewish communities working to bring these issues to the forefront in our communities, and the Facing the Nakba project that I'm part of grew out of our relationship with Zochrot. They also look concretely at how return can look, and it's very worth going to their website. It's Zochrot, ZOCHROT.org. For example, you'll see on their website that some of the questions they address include, what might return actually look like on the ground? What needs will have to be met for the refugees to come home and be reabsorbed? How would major social institutions be reorganized to prepare for return? Zochrot encourages Israeli Jews to recognize that creating a space based on the rights of refugees and their descendants to return home is not about expelling anyone, but it's about building a society that ensures equal rights for all and that is not rooted in a relationship of occupier and occupied. So in terms of looking forward, the Palestinian-led call for boycott, divestment, and sanctions, BDS, is growing across the globe. It is a call until Israel complies with basic principles of international law and human rights. And of course, the right of return is one of those rights. It is not a call to deny people of their rights. It is a vision and a call affirmatively for equal rights and dignity for all those living in Palestine and Israel. Despite the attacks on BDS from Israel's supporters, it is, in my view, quite a straightforward and I would say elegant call for justice. And as I said in the beginning of my remarks, I do believe that the more we understand the root cause of for BDS, that is, the more we understand about the Nakba, the more the right of return and the full BDS call not only makes sense, but is in fact the only ethical path. Thank you.
That's beautiful. Thank you everyone so much for being here. I'm so honored to be on this panel. First, thank you so much for Brooklyn for Peace, especially Naomi and Charlotte for doing this organizing. It's really fun for putting together these panels. As someone who's put together panels, it's a lot of work, so really thank you so much, and for everyone packing this room. If you have room next to you or any seats or whatever, if you can just make room, if you have any bags taking up any space, there are just some people standing, so I'm always one of those people who comes in late and then I'm just kind of like looking to see if I can squish in. So if you can just kind of raise your hand if you have room, so folks who, not all abilities are differently able abilities show, so if folks need a seat, you can just please feel free to wander in. I'm definitely somebody who will trip over people as well when I try to sneak in gracefully and then show that I'm not graceful. I come to these panels late. And also I'm so honored to be on a panel with not only some of the biggest heroes in social justice movements, but people that I don't know how I got lucky to call my personal friends. But I don't know if, Riham remembers. I met her during law school at one of, the many Palestine protests in New York, and came up to her and was like, oh, this is really awesome, radical Palestinian woman, I want to be just like her. And he took a flyer from her in one of the protests, and I met Jamil when I was a law student, and met him at Human Rights Watch, and he was this amazing lawyer already doing all this radical work, and I wanted to be just like him. And he helped mentor me, and I sought him out for advice, and took me for a coffee, and was like, how do I do this radical work and not get blacklisted? And met Donna when I was already learning under her amazing partner Alan. It was like, how do I already get to learn under this amazing civil rights litigator? And basically he was, in not so many words, like, you think I'm cool, meet my partner. And he was right. So, and Donna's become one of my best friends. So I just hope you all get to be as lucky as I am to get to be friends with your heroes. So I just want to start with that, because so much of this work is really also just, if you love the people you're doing with too, it's just, then you kind of feel like you can do it forever. So, so with that, I want to, place what we're talking about in a larger political context. We could talk, there's so much more that I'm sure we'd all, I would love to say too, in addition to the brilliant words of Riham and Jamil and Donna. But I would also love to start with, putting this in the larger political framework of, more than just Palestine, and as much as I do this work not just because I love Palestine and the struggle for Palestine, and the cause for Palestine is so just and so noble, but that we do this work because it's a noble human rights struggle, and because we care about human rights. I personally don't do this work just because I love Palestine, but because I love justice and I care about justice, and I can't stand any injustice or any human rights violation to occur, especially if we can organize and do something about it. And so Palestine, and particularly the right of return and what we're talking about, is really a human rights struggle like all human rights struggles. And it's no different. So placing it in a context of indigenous struggles for self-determination and the freedom of movement, as we've talked about, and the right to just a basic home and homeland, to be free of colonization and be free of cleansing of one's land, of your history and your peoples and your culture, and freedom from racial segregation. I mean, these are all things that I think have brought people to this room, brought people to their different varying organizations, and that's the theme and the thread that I think weaves through a lot of New York City, but weaves through a lot of why people come to this work and out into the streets. And we have to be morally consistent, right, in our struggles for justice. And so we can't be, as we often hear, they're progressive except for Palestine, right? PEPs. Or, I'm just, or poops, right? Progressive, only, right? Only, right? So you can't, be progressive except for, right? Like the same thing where you couldn't say, I'm sure people wouldn't really accept if someone was like, I'm progressive except for the black and brown folks, right? Or I'm progressive except for the women, or the, gender non-conforming folks. Because I think it would be okay to then say, well, if you're progressive except for Palestine or for women, then I would just say, well, maybe you're really not progressive. And so we need to challenge that, because I don't think there should be an except after that statement. You should just be progressive, or maybe let's push over to radical a little bit, and we'll maybe get there later. So talking about these other examples maybe can help lead us into, and maybe you can all start to think about, well, what brought you into social justice work in the first place? Like, what were your first entry points into social justice work? So for many people, thinking back to the South African apartheid example. So that, of course, was a very classic example of the anti-colonial struggle against an occupier claiming an inherent and exclusive right to South Africa and South African land. So white Afrikaans proposed an unjust compromise when, of course, the struggle against South African apartheid reached its feverish height. Proposed this unjust compromise as saying, well, we can create these Bantustans, right, for indigenous black South Africans, or segregated lands, as one set of land will be for the white occupier Afrikaans, and one will be for the black indigenous South Africans. And, this will be okay. This will be our solution. This will be our compromise. Instead of conceding full decolonization or full desegregation, this will be a way that we can live and we can compromise. We're not going to let, black South Africans be able to live over all of black South Africa. You'll just live in these sections, and this will be okay. This is how it's going to be. And that, of course, was rejected by black indigenous South Africans as not an acceptable solution. And because it stopped far short of true justice. And so, what people are seeing, I'm saying this is very similar to denying the right of return to all of Palestinian refugees to be able to return to their homelands and to live in a desegregated Palestine, to be able to claim the right to be able to return home wherever my home is, where I claim the right of return is. Wherever my home was is where my home was. And the right to where my land and my family is. And wherever you want to say where Israel is, if that is where my home is, I have the right to return. And so in this anti-apartheid struggle, this anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa was, of course, characterized as illegal and violent. And the ANC, the African National Congress, at one point was declared unlawful and exiled and banned, and pushed out of South Africa. Now, of course, the ANC is the ruling party in South Africa since the fall of apartheid in 1994. 1994, people, by the way, I would just like to put that out there. It's not that long ago. I graduated high school in 1997. You can do the math. But, that's not that long ago. So, and I sort of remember the struggles for, anti-apartheid. So it's not that long ago, just to put everything in context. It also just shows that we can win. But it's still not over, of course. Formal legal apartheid ended. Economic apartheid still exists within South Africa. That's a whole other discussion. But, many activists come to this work from their work in other freedom struggles and struggles for justice. So, of course, similar to our U.S. apartheid, the civil rights movement in this country fought against our own legalized apartheid and racial violence and racial segregation. That, of course, was its own compromise, where our systems tried to compromise and say, well, we'll propose, the civil rights movement fought against this legalized racial segregation, where white supremacy proposed in this country. Jim Crow was as a compromise to full, desegregation and full racial justice and full radical, liberation for folks of color. Like, well, we'll just have Jim Crow, right? We can just have things separate, and this is going to be equal. This is going to be okay. We're not going to really allow people to live where they want to live and allow freedom of movement and full human rights, and this is going to be okay, right? Because things are, relatively, equal, right? And we've ended, the most brutal forms of violence, and this is going to be okay. And of course, as we know, that was roundly rejected. And, this, overtly racial discrimination has, as we know in the books, as lawyers know, that's overt racial discriminatory laws have been outlawed. Hopefully everybody in this room also knows we clearly have not won the fight to abolish racism in this country. I hope everyone is clearly out in the streets with us. But as we know, that this has been rejected, at least formally on the books, and these struggles are still being fought. So, so everyone's starting to think of the juices of what brings you to social justice work, and what were the first things that brought you to brought you to this work. So for me, my personal story And why people might, oftentimes, and it's always a compliment for me, people will think that I'm Palestinian and will come speak Arabic to me, and I wish my mom, when she made me read the Quran out loud in Arabic, that she actually taught me what it meant. As many Muslims know, we read the Quran out loud in Arabic. I'm like, I speak Urdu, and I wish she had taught me Arabic, but I don't actually speak Arabic. I'm Pakistani and I'm Muslim. So many people think I'm Palestinian. So it's a compliment, but of course I'm Pakistani. And so then people will be like, oh, why are you fighting so hard for Palestine? And I laugh because, many people don't really know the history of Pakistan, how it was created, and the history of South Asia. And for me personally, I don't come to this movement simply because I'm Muslim. Some people might think, well, Muslims just care about Palestine, and there's something like the Dome of the Rock, right? And it's something holy, and Muslims all care about it. Well, no, yes, there is, but I came to Palestine because of my family's own struggle for basic human rights and dignity. So my family, my father was 9 years old, and then, of course, my grandparents were older. My entire family survived the partition of India with the fall of the British Empire and the decolonization process, as Frantz Fanon will, of course, say that the decolonization process is inherently violent in most countries when they are decolonized by their foreign occupiers. So the British occupied India for a very long time, and during that decolonization process in 1947, it was one of the bloodiest civil wars in human history. So my family survived that decolonization process. They were lucky to survive, but my father was 9 years old, his older brother was a few years older, and they all survived the partition process where Pakistan and Bangladesh, which at that time was East Pakistan, was created. And within, they say, the stroke of midnight, millions of people were displaced. It was the largest forced mass transfer of human beings in recorded human history. And millions of people were trafficked and murdered, if not mutilated. Children were trafficked back and forth. Women were raped and murdered back and forth. Families were separated. And my father and his older siblings and younger siblings saw all of it. They lost a sibling at one point. They fled for their lives. People are murdered in front of children. Villages are burned. And so people see this. These stories are passed down to me, to my siblings. And so, that story is very powerful, and it kind of passes down to, the next generation. And so you grow up with that story, and it's not even like, my dad taught me about Palestine, but not like, you should care about Palestine because you should care about Palestine. It's more like, you should care about human rights, because I've lived through, what it's like to be displaced, or I've lived through what it's like to be ripped from your homeland. I've lived through what it's like to see your village burned down. I've lived through what it's like to run outside in just your t-shirt, and that's literally the only belongings you have. I've lived through running to a refugee camp, and that refugee camp you have to flee after a month because the mobs are coming and they're going to then they come and murder everyone in the entire refugee camp. And I've lived through then being smuggled into a caravan truck that's covered in canvas, and that's the way you survive. So it gets emotional. So those are the stories that people grew up with, and I want to bring those stories in the room, because that's what we're talking about.
Thank you.
Thank you to the person who said thank you, gave me a moment to be like, oh, okay, we're okay, whoever that was. So, and so my family moved over the border to Pakistan. And Pakistan is its own version of special. So then, Pakistan isn't over either, because my family is its own persecuted sect within Islam. So we're Ahmadi Muslims. So Ahmadis in 1977 were declared non-Muslim by the Pakistani constitution. So we don't have equal rights within Pakistan. So if you have a Pakistani passport, you're declared non-Muslim. So we can't actually get into Mecca, for instance, is one thing. Is if we present a Pakistani passport, you are not granted permission to enter. So and so many of my family have left Pakistan and fled. So these are the stories that we talk about. So if people think about why do you care about Palestine, it's like, why do you not care about Palestine? Why do you not care about human rights violations and children being torn from their families? And so when we talk about children being torn from their families, everyone is and should be, or everyone in my world, and everyone should be torn, and up in arms about the children being torn from their families at the border. And that is what's happening, in Palestine, when we talk about the children being, murdered at the border when they march to try to return home from Gaza. And, when we talk about, for instance, the mass incarceration conversation in this country is finally happening. And that's partly, the stories of my family and the stories of so many other families is partly why I became a public defender. Is that, that's I think about Ahed Tamimi and this, how everyone rightly was so enraged at this, she's a child being jailed for months for what? And then I think of the children that I represent, that New York is one of the last states that, still charges children as adults for crimes. And it's no different, when we fight for those human rights of people who are incarcerated and ripped from their families because you're poor and you're black and you're brown. It's like these are the struggles that if that brings you out in the streets, as fighting Trump's or Obama's or our country's deportation machine, because a border has declared them somehow unlawful because that border crossed them, not because they crossed the border, or because we've incarcerated them and their families and we just decided whatever act they committed was illegal. If that brings you out in the streets, or if any kind of war, and the genocide that we commit in other countries brings you out in the streets, and Palestine should too. And that's sort of the message that I hope that me bringing up my family's story brings up for other people. And I hope that people see, I know that Palestine and the right of return can be a struggle for people, but if these other struggles are not a struggle for you, then Palestine shouldn't be either. So I'll end with that, and then we'll go into a question and answer, but thank you guys so much for being here.
So now I'd just like to welcome Tom to make a little pitch, and then we will get through to the next part of the program.
Thank you, yeah. Well, thank you everybody for being here, and I hope you enjoyed this program as much as I did. Just an incredibly valuable talk from all the participants. And these things do not come freely. We are paying or we're giving an honorarium to each of the people up here, and we have rent to pay for the space. These buckets are supposed to be, Naomi is passing one, and somebody else has got the other bucket, I hope.
Dawn.
Okay. So please give what you can. The biggest thing of all is that according to your donations will make it possible for us to do more of these programs in the future. So we'll just really appreciate you being generous. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. I want to thank our three speakers for such compelling perspectives. It's unique voices, in-depth analysis, understanding emotional connections, and again, thank you. Very well done. Before we get to the question and comments component, we have with us also here tonight Ms. Besma Eid. She is the program director for the LEAD program, and she's going to give us some concrete ways where we can reach out and work with refugees in Lebanon. Besma.
Yeah, thank you, Riham. Can folks hear me if I project loudly or use the mic? Cool. Thank you to this wonderful panel, to Naomi, she's over there, for organizing tonight. I think it's really beautiful seeing such a full space, a full room of folks that are here to really commit to the right of return, right? And so if we're people that are passionate and compassionate in the struggle for liberation in Palestine, we can't only be having this conversation tonight about the right of return. It's something that's so fundamental for any type of liberation. So I just want to kind of start with that. And I wanted to share a little bit about the organization that I've been a part of since 2012. We're a very low-key, nonprofit, small, volunteer-run, grassroots-based organization called the LEAP program. So LEAP stands for Learning for the Empowerment and the Advancement of Palestinians. We work primarily in Lebanon. So Lebanon is home to over 500,000 Palestinian refugees. It's actually home to refugees from all over the Arab world. And as we've been hearing today, right, if the right of return, really was implemented, organizations like LEAP wouldn't have to exist, and I wish that that was the case, right? We want to be striving for a moment where we're not working in solidarity with the community in exile, right? Those communities should be in their homelands. But until that liberation happens, we've been working since 2010 with Palestinian, as well as Syrian and Palestinians from Syria, with youth who are living in the camps. And oftentimes these are kids who are third, fourth generation refugees who've been born into the refugee-ness in Lebanon. So we provide various kind of educational and arts programming, but a big part of it is this idea of mutual empowerment, right? So we bring folks from the West, from the diaspora, to come to Lebanon, to understand what the reality is for the refugees who are living there. But then they're responsible that for when they come back to their homeland, whether it's here in the States, whether it's in Palestine even, whether it's in the West, somewhere else in Europe, that they have a responsibility of really uplifting the stories and the voices of the community in Lebanon. And so every year we meet with elders who fled Palestine in 1948, and every year they request of us, listen, when you go back to New York, when you go back to Germany, when you go back to wherever, tell them about us, right? We're not here to be forgotten. We will never forget our homeland, and we need you to be fighting with us. So a lot of our work really is based in this idea of solidarity and this idea of mutual empowerment, like I mentioned. And there's lots of things I could talk about specifically around the situation in Lebanon. I know we don't have a lot of time, but feel free to come up to me afterward. I'd love to talk to folks about ways to get involved, ways to support organizations like LEAP. Follow us on Facebook. If you are on Facebook, I'm sure everyone has a smartphone, pull it out, follow us on Facebook. Feel free to sign up for our mailing list. We send delegations to Lebanon every summer as well as throughout the year. There's a lot of volunteer opportunities. And we also look for events like this. We look for spaces where we can talk to people in the community and share back the stories of the community in Lebanon. So I just want to say thank you, and I look forward to talking to more of you later.
Thank you, Destiny. Thank you for the important work that you and LEAP program are doing. So now we're going to turn over to questions and comments. We'd like to take 3 at a time, and then the speakers will address them. It can be a comment. Brooklyn for Peace is interested in making this a discussion. All questions are welcome. All perspectives are welcome as long as we speak with respect. And so we have one over here, and one over here, and one over here. We'll start with those 3. Go ahead, sir.
I've been listening to these speeches for years. We all know what has happened in Palestine. What can we as a people do? Can we go and demonstrate? Can we go in front of the UN or the Israeli Council? What can we do? We hear a lot of talk. I come and hear a lot of talk, and I want to do something about it. What can we do?
I believe that since 1967, Israel has been a proxy state for the United States, and that's why we protected them internationally. What happened the first 20 years? 1948, 1949. How did the international community allow Israel to violate the Declaration of Universal Human Rights, United Nations resolutions, and everything else with total impunity? Who was protecting them and why?
My question is what is the impact, do you think, that when Trump has now defunded UNRWA, what's the impact on the Palestinian population and politically on the kind of the resolution attempts moving forward?
Now this family.
We got just 3 questions.
Good question. Okay, good.
Second round.
Yes, thank you.
I'll start. So I think these are really terrific questions and give us a chance to elaborate more, particularly about where we are now with where the refugees are in terms of the geopolitical situation, and particularly what this administration and this country has been doing. Let's just start with one thing. The United States as a government have endorsed the resolution about refugee rights. It consistently said that they should be upheld until we started with the Oslo agreement, with the Oslo negotiations. This is what the turning point when the Clinton administration started saying the issue of the refugees has to be negotiated between the parties. and started to sell this idea that the parties that you're talking about is like parties to have a contract between two equal parties. Like one that they're just fighting over a sort of a real estate somewhere in Brooklyn. Whereas the truth of the matter is that there is no equality in terms of what are these parties are doing. One has been the most powerful, occupying, taking all the resources of the people who've been completely disenfranchised and disempowered and essentially pushed out of their own homeland. And then they are now asked to come and negotiate. So there is this narrative that is being pushed that if only the Palestinians come to agree to sort of like whether it's a two-state solution or a three-state solution or whatever solution, but they are not willing to come to the table and be negotiating these things. And as Riham mentioned, I think is a really important thing. There are certain rights are non-negotiable. Just like you can't negotiate your own dignity. How can you do that? Can you just say, oh, I'm just going to put it out on the market, on eBay, and say, oh, I'm going to sell myself? And that is how Palestinians consistently ask for a very simple thing. Treat us like all equal human beings that you are treating any other crisis. Everywhere in the world, when you talk about the refugee crisis, and we have 65 million people displaced around the world, we talk about the first thing about how to provide them protection and safe haven, and think about how they can be repatriated, returned to their homes. No one says, oh, refugees, let's just get them continue in that endless situation, except for the Palestinians. Palestinians have this exceptional category that was the Palestinian refugees it would be difficult to get them to return because there is this idea that if they return, the sky will fall and then there will be no such a thing as a state of Israel. Now, I think I have to challenge that notion. How is it that possible when you are talking about millions of people thousands of millions of people were brought to Israel that had no connection whatsoever, right? And then they got immigrated and they called Aliyah with a special ministry called the Ministry of Aliyah, Ministry of Absorbing Immigrants. You get a basket of financial aid and all of that kind of stuff just to get you to come and settle in Israel, while that refugee who could share that place, if you wish, if you're thinking about that. But the notion that it's a zero-sum game cannot really be sustained over time because the Palestinians are not going anywhere and they continue, generation over generation, is going to continue to assert their right. Now the question is how does it really come to action? And this is the second part of the question, and relating it to UNRWA. So UNRWA, by the way, when it was created in the early 50s, it was created in order to provide the support to the Palestinian refugees until they exercise their right of return, until the Resolution 194 would be essentially realized. UNRWA is the UN agency, the refugee agency, that essentially been established in order to provide the very basic services of education, health. It started with many refugee camps from Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, as well as now in Gaza. And this agency is the one where most refugees are registered. I can give you the numbers that are really just to give you a sense of where you can get the sense. You have now a 6.1 point. First of all, there's no official numbers for how many registered Palestinian in terms of like the actual number, because the numbers that are registered with the refugees with UNRWA doesn't represent all Palestinian refugees. But the ones that are registered with UNRWA, the ones from 1948 is 6.14 million as of 2014, including 5.9 million refugees registered and assisted by UNRWA. Roughly 30% of the registered refugees live in camps from Gaza, some of the West Bank, Lebanon, the Syria, and Jordan. The distribution of registered refugees, 40% are in Jordan, 24% roughly in Gaza, 17% roughly in West Bank, 10% in Syria, and 9% in Lebanon. In Syria, by the way, because of the civil war, they've been displaced another time. And their own refugee camp became a disastrous place and a war zone that they could not stay there. So UNRWA was really one of the most important organizations that provided the kind of the hope for people, for generations of refugees. And without that agency, I think that we would be probably worse off as far as poverty, as far as being a community and a nation with no hope and with no education and with no sense of building a future for all. And what is now on the table by this administration is two things. One is to use UNRWA in order to pressure the Palestinian leadership to agree to a peace plan that no one have ever seen, including the King of Jordan, who said, haven't even seen what they're talking about. They're talking about a peace plan that nobody has seen. And they wanted to make sure that they use it as a bargaining chip. So if the Palestinians say, well, you don't come to the table, you don't agree to the peace plan that they haven't seen, we will stop funding UNRWA. So to divide the Palestinians within and to deprive the most vulnerable communities in the Palestinians their very basic needs. The second thing they want to do is to eliminate UNRWA. Eliminate UNRWA meaning to eliminate the right of return and to eliminate the sense of the Palestinians have this right, because the UNRWA is really providing the hope and providing the kind of support for them, that they are able to sustain even the worst conditions in camps, in countries where they were pushed to the side of the margins of the society. And then the third thing is really to say, well, you know, UNRWA it's part of this denial of the Nakba and the refugee issue by saying not all of those people, millions of people who are refugees and their descendants, should be considered as refugees. Only the ones who actually were in 1948 refugees are the ones who are supposed to be counted as refugees. This is a new thing, new definition of who constitutes a refugee. Under international law, you have the refugees and their descendants. As long as you maintain a genuine link to your country of origin, as long as you're able to connect, the mass majority of Palestinian refugees live within 60 miles of their homeland. 60 miles. Whether they are in Gaza, they are the closest, obviously, the West Bank, but we're talking about Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon. And so there's no one can deny that there's no genuine link to their homeland, to the country, to their separated families, to their community, to all the places that they left in 48 and they could not come back. So I think one thing you can do is protest this attack on UNRWA. And there's nothing is being said in Washington about this. People should be up in arms. When people are really protesting about refugee crisis here in this country, they're saying, you know, we should ask those same people, ask the same politicians. If you really care about refugees, you should care about all refugees. If you care about human beings in a war zone, you should care about all human beings in all war zones. There's no division because of the fact that some people get a second-class sort of categorization of refugees. And the Palestinian refugees are the largest community of refugees since World War II, by the way. And it's been, obviously, the displacement and the horrific tragedy of the Syrian people and their refugee crisis is one of the largest, and I think we could see that it's even becoming bigger than the Nakba of the Palestinians. And so if we say yes, we say the Palestinian, just like the Palestinian people went through the Nakba, there's other crisis, but we should make sure that we're consistent. And I thank you, Bina, for making that call. For you cannot really be progressive. So many people are so champions of human rights, but when it comes to real issues, when it comes to Israel, human rights kind of like, there's only to certain people who belong to a particular religion. And there are so many people who are refugee champions, both here in the United States and in Israel, including refugee agencies and organizations that call them their civil rights organizations, like the ADL, that they are actually the ones who would support Israel in crushing and killing nearly 150 civilians in Gaza who were protesting because they want to get out of the siege of Gaza and because they wanted to return to their home. And so that is the sort of the thing that we should protest. We should call for concrete actions. 250 million deficit in UNRWA because of the Trump administration pulling out funding.
Where we protest and when? I'll be the first speaker at the protest. I'll put my life on the line. Excuse me. It's right here in the United States. You don't have to go overseas. The Zionist lobby is greater than the NRA. It's right here in the United States. And if we don't stand up as a people and say, hey, you're doing the wrong thing, let's do the right thing. Why don't we just all get together, all the peace organizations? I go to many meetings. I'm a member of the Jewish Voice for Peace. All right? Why don't we all get together and have a big demonstration and raise our voice?
Donna and Bina an opportunity to respond to the first set of questions and then take another set of questions and comments.
The only thing I would add, I think Jamil adds so much. Everything you're saying, there's so little I could even add to that. Everything's so eloquent and perfect. Just with the other protests, there's so many representatives of different organizations in the room, like Adalah-NY and JBP, who are doing amazing work and so many creative and powerful protests and campaigns. They're outside, protesting Chuck Schumer's office for his disgusting statements about the massacres in Gaza, to targeting the exchanges between the Israeli occupying forces of Hamas and defense forces. We know they're not a defense army, and then training U.S. police forces on how to actually target our people and civilians here in this country, and that exchange and how disgusting and deadly that is. They're, I think, connecting with those organizations and the many different organizations on the ground here. I think those are already happening. Obviously, the call for BDS is growing, and I think BDS is a very powerful tool, and I think we've talked about that already, but I think there are amazing organizations doing that work in New York, and I think already maybe not reinventing the wheel, but perhaps already supporting those organizations doing the work. And lifting up voices that are already the radical voices doing that, and Palestinian voices doing that work.
Yeah, I would like to second that, and to say also that I think within the organizations, there's always, we know the moment we're in, and that it requires from cultural resistance to all different forms of organizing and resistance that are taking place. And at least in my experience, and I think in others, more and more groups are coming together, including from the movement for justice in Palestine, the movement for Black Lives, immigrant rights, and other racial justice movements. So I think that is growing. I do want to make a little plug for community education and why I do think it's so important. And I'll speak from my experience as someone who feels a responsibility to do work within the communities I'm part of, within Jewish communities I'm part of. Many of us began, even when we started criticizing Israel, we began about 1967. So we were opposed to the occupation of 67. That's where it began. And unless we really understand about the Nakba, it really then from understanding about the Nakba, again, the right of return is not a difficult concept to understand why it's a right of return. And to take that to the next step, since the BDS movement, the movement for boycott, divestment, and sanctions is growing, many of us are concerned about how we can continue to have it grow within our communities and to have more and more support. And so I don't look at the community education over there and the organizing there. I see it as an integral part of our organizing, and that the more we understand these issues and are always thinking about how do they then impact and shape and inform our work for justice. So I see it as part of a whole.
So we'll do the second round. I saw earlier you had your hand up, and then we'll go over here and over here. Go ahead.
I know families are targeted and traumatize our families, leave us in shock like a deer with a flashlight. Those of us as parents. I would like to ask how many people in this body right now are not biological parents? Because you will have to play the strategic role of making sure we stay emotionally stable and don't get knocked off track. How many of them non-parents? Raise your hands, please. Non-parents, non-biological parents. We'd like to ask you to really stand strong with us so we don't get distracted with the families being targeted and ripped out of our arms. We become traumatized, right? That happens right here in Brooklyn. It happened to me for 13 years. And I would like to suggest that we make family courts one of the areas that we target around the fire barrels. Because family courts, without family, society fails, yes? So we have to make sure we hold families strong, and all the children become our most important resource, and we'll let no children go hurt or harmed. If they do, we will bring the numbers to the family court starting at 6 a.m. in the morning on Wednesdays, I think. It's a Wednesday. Good day for you? Wednesday, 6 o'clock all the way to 5 o'clock. We let them know for 5 barrels that our children are not to be targeted. And Wednesday, and then we go to any other organization that you want from there, but we must make sure that understands you can't fail families anymore. If you look around, you see some families are intact, right? So they know that if they keep their families intact, they can get the goods. So that's my point. I had a question in there, but I forget the question.
Thank you.
Hi, so I understand that the BDS movement has been very effective.
Speak up.
I understand that the BDS movement has been very effective, but it's also been at times discredited, especially by like prominent figures such as Alan Dershowitz, who actually took the time to fight against the movement. How do we discredit professors like him or other people who have been so vocal against the movement and have essentially undermined its effectiveness? And how do we amplify the movement?
I would just like to add to what the panelists have been saying and in terms of what we can do as a Palestinian, Jordanian, American refugee, whatever the hell you want to call me, right? We are everywhere, we exist, and so forth. I'm a teacher in a private school in Manhattan, and many of my students come from Jewish backgrounds, and I teach history, including the history of the Middle East, which of course includes the unit in Palestine and Israel. And in the last 6 years, I've really learned to hear the idea that from our youth, from our kids in this city, what it means to feel connected to Israel. What that means, what that narrative signifies for our youth. And that, in many ways, is normalized in our city and in our country. And I would invite us in our different circles, whether it's with one another, with our kids, with our grandkids, with our friends, over drinks, over dinner, wherever it is, to normalize the idea that Palestinians have rights. That seems so commonsensical to us, but truly it isn't at the mainstream level. The idea that, number one, we're not just Arabs, and as awful as that idea is, that Arabs therefore don't deserve rights, right? There's no such thing as Palestine, they're just Arabs, right? As the racism embedded in that is something we can bring about in this moment in our country. Given the intersectionality of so many of our causes, take this moment in your hands, talk to your kids, your grandkids, your friends, your colleagues about what it means to just join that idea of Palestinianness deserving something humane. It's a simple thing, but it's challenging for many of our circles. I understand this. But I invite you to really invite that into many of your conversations.
Two excellent comments, but one main question about how do you deal with all of the attacks on BDS and the attempts to discredit BDS? And I have to turn it over to you. I would like to answer, but I'm not going to.
You sure?
Okay.
Come on.
Don't insist. I got it. So I think, first of all, boycott, divestment, and sanctions, the fact that it's being so, targeted and by anti-BDS legislation, by many individuals, by people losing their jobs or their tenure tracks, by students being put on websites because they are part of Students for Justice in Palestine. I think it's telling how strong and what potential this movement to boycott Israel is. And I think that we don't need to waste time on addressing the Alan Dershowitz of the world. They're not our objective. Our objective is to look for people that believe in social justice, to explain that Palestine is a social justice movement like Black Lives Matter, like the indigenous movements, like immigrant rights, like labor rights, and to make those connections clear to people. And we, as Palestinians, are telling you, all we want you to do is to stop supporting our occupier. We will resist, we will liberate ourselves, but stop helping our occupier oppress us, because that's what the US is doing as a government and as individuals. And if we can get that message out, we will be able to overcome, because there is Palestinian struggle on the ground. There is many ways that people can work in solidarity. There is a need for humanitarian assistance and support, because people have to still live and breathe and eat and feed their children. But the most important thing is to address, as everybody on the panel has said, the root causes of this, which is the Israeli colonization and continued apartheid against Palestinians. And I think boycott, divestment, and sanctions with different organizations. Look at the US campaign. There's so many different campaigns going on around the United States. Adalah-NY in New York. Jewish Voice for Peace is active, as Bina said, as Donna has said. So there's so many organizations that are really actively working on the ground, and I think we can be a part of it. And I want us to get out of our US-centric world right now, because we are in a really dark place in the US. This morning at 3 o'clock when I woke up, I don't know why I woke up at 3, but I was looking through my Twitter, because that's how I get news these days. I can't do regular news anymore. And, you know, one of the first tweets was the UK Labour Party has adopted an arms embargo against Israel, right? So they passed a resolution for supporting an arms embargo. Can you imagine? Like, this is major. This is what sanctions is, right? When we talked about the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement in 2005 in Palestine, when we developed this call, we thought we were going to do boycott, maybe a little bit of divestment, and sanctions was far, far down the road. Now, major cities in Spain, in Italy, are becoming apartheid-free zones, right? This Labour Party is the biggest, component of it yet. But the next tweet that I read was Trump or whoever it is accepts the new or passes a law for a new definition of anti-Semitism that would incorporate within the Department of Education, that would incorporate any criticism of Israel as anti-Semitic. This is the struggle that we are fighting for. So this is where the education comes in. This is where being in the streets and protesting and doing things more jointly and working together as a Palestine Solidarity movement comes together. But this is where we have to, this is where our struggle is right now in the US.
I just want to emphasize one more thing that's really important. I mean, Riham covered it really well, but one thing that we're seeing is that we're not just hearing people like Alan Dershowitz who are saying, oh, you should just take my analysis of the situation in Palestine. But we're seeing a movement that's trying to shut down conversation about the subject. It's not about just everybody that should be a BDS active. It's about the whole idea to have any conversation, whether it's on college campuses, whether it's on the churches, whether it's in some synagogues, whether it's in just states. It's going really in a very dangerous direction, whereas the very fundamental right to speak and to express your opinion is being under attack for the mayor, and because you are challenging this notion that you're daring to say that why is it people talking about boycotting Israel? I remember after Hurricane Harvey hit the Texas area, there was a small town that followed the law that was passed by Texas that basically said that any contracts that were signed and any resources, particularly contracts signed between the state and anybody who is party to this contract, has to pledge to boycott Israel. Right? These are part of those anti-BDS laws. and the town, not to boycott Israel. Yeah, sorry.
We wish it was
Not to boycott Israel. So the pledge was that you have to say that you are basically, you're giving up your right to do the very basic thing that anybody can choose, you know? And yet, the people who were trying to get relief aid, like from the hurricane, were told, you have to sign this piece of paper that says you have to pledge that you are not boycotting Israel. As people started to talk about it, why is that the issue? So because of the fact that there are now people who are talking about the idea of the boycott, people are asking, well, if there's a boycott, because there are so many, boycott movement has been so effective in this country. You don't have to go to South Africa. I think actually the people who in this country who boycotted, who had boycott campaigns, used it in order to support South African and the ANC in South Africa. But in this country, there's so many ways that we use boycott, and yet when it comes to the state of Israel, there is this question that this is not legitimate. That this is would be something that would be outlawed and it should be criminalized, whether these are state laws or federal laws. So I really think that we are talking about the very notion that that everybody should be concerned about. And then the reason that the people are freaking out about this is because the BDS movement is putting equality into the equation in all of that issues that it's trying to address, equality. And the state of Israel, there's a myth that Israel is a democracy. We can go and talk on and on. I give you my analysis of my experience living there, going to school there, practicing law there. And the question, whenever you counter the Zionist idea of the project with the idea of equality and a truly liberal democracy, then there's a crisis. And that's why I think it's getting very, very difficult reactions, because in the idea that Israel is a Jewish state, that it's serving the Jewish majority only, that if you are not Jewish, you don't have equal rights. The state is not a citizen state. It's not a state for all its citizens. It's a state limited to whether you belong to the right religion. So for me, I was raised in Israel as a second, by law. Before this law that is now getting us more attention, the nation-state law, Israel has been always a state that has excluded non-Jews from equal rights. So when you bring a movement of people who are raising awareness about the notion of equality and democratic values, this becomes very uncomfortable for people who have really thought that Israel is the realization of some sort of a dream of like this truly democratic state in the Middle East. And that, I think, we should question why is that and why people are really scared about having conversation. I don't know how people will decide whether they will support the Palestinian rights for liberation or not, but at least let's have the conversation. Isn't that too much to ask?
We're going to have Naomi. There was a lady over here, and then this gentleman. And I'm not sure, correct me if I'm wrong, this might be the last round we can do.
No.
No?
No, we don't have to be at 9:30. All right. Here's the question I get all the time. Say the Palestinian refugees are allowed to return. People are living in their houses, Israeli Jews. Or their houses have been demolished to form military installations. Or their houses no longer exist because there's a park there now. What happens next? Logistically, in terms of demographics, what happens next?
Well, I'd just like to say that I really believe that it's not only Palestine that's been occupied by the Zionists, but our own government has been occupied by the Zionists. And I would like to know if there is an organization specifically or a movement specifically to develop inroads with the media to get that message out.
Yeah.
We are zeroing in on the Palestinians. I would like to have you consider talking about the evangelicals in this country, Donald Trump and all, who are very pro-Israel. It's a struggle. We can't talk to them because they are totally against the Palestinians. What can we do in this country about that? Now we have a Zionist government, my opinion, a Zionist government in the White House. How much further is it going to go?
Would you repeat that question if you can, please?
Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think he was asking, how do we address the white supremacists, the Zionism that's now existing in the White House, the evangelicals, the Christian Zionists that are now in control, and very related to the question that we had over here.
Did he say Christian Zionists?
Yeah, Christian Zionists.
Yes, did he say Christian Zionists?
Christian Zionists.
Christian Zionists. He didn't say Christian Zionists, right conservative, cherry far one, those guys. And the Hackersons.
So the question about how practically the right of return and refugees returning and repatriated, absorbed, welcomed back, how does that actually work? First of all, I think, as I said in the beginning, you have to acknowledge and recognize that right. And then start with thinking about ways that you can make it happen, and the promise that that would bring into what is instead of the investment in the military installations or the military aid and the military budgeting. How can you shift that towards building more towns and cities, if not on where they were where the refugees lived? And that's one of the things that international says. It doesn't say necessarily the right of return has to substitute or come at the cost of innocent individual civilians that are living in a place where that refugees left before they were deported or were forced to leave. The idea is to provide an alternative that is realizing that right to the extent possible. And that could be, yes, if you understand and you study the geography of the country, you see that there's a lot of areas that are not developed. In fact, every time you hear about developing the Galilee and the Negev, what does that mean? That means let's bring more Jews to the Galilee and the Negev, because the Galilee and the Negev have less Jews than the state of Israel wants to have in those areas. My family originally comes from the Galilee. It is majority Palestinians living in the Galilee. If you travel in the area, which is a very beautiful area, you'll see there's a lot of areas where you can actually develop and you can come up with plans, alternative plans that are really would build a future for both Palestinians and Israelis who are living there. But the idea should come from first deconstruct this idea that there are certain people who are the chosen people, who have more rights than other people, who have first right to the particular land or place, and there are other people who are going to be have to compromise and go only to Ramallah or the West Bank at best. That's part of the right of return as part of any reconciliation. Real reconciliation, if you read Ilan Pape's book, The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine, I think it's a very, very excellent analysis. He says the reason that the peace talks and the Oslo Accords failed is because it really failed to acknowledge the Nakba and this idea, recognizing and acknowledging the Palestinian refugees and their right of return. It doesn't mean that all Palestinians who were refugees or their descendants want to return to Palestine or Israel tomorrow. Some may decide, you know what, we may not want to be ready for this emotional and traumatic and the ongoing struggle that, for example, as Bina said rightly, South African are dealing with now, with the economic injustice that prevails. But we should think about those models. There are some Israelis that are already thinking about ways to do that. They are a very small minority, but there are ones who are actually reading the future. Are we really going to continue this confrontation and this control over other people and preventing them by force from coming back to their homeland, instead of thinking, you know what, look at that. There is no empire that survived. There is no power that remained the same force forever. There's a certain point that there's going to be a breaking point. How can we save lives? How can we really maintain and create a hope and a future that could be the place for it, and the country can absorb all the people who live there? The other thing that is really a failing thing, since Israel was created in 1948 until now, the Zionist idea was to bring all Jews into Israel. Most Jews live outside Israel, Palestine, to this day. And if you ask the question why, the question is why would people not want to go and live in where they are living now? Because first of all, there is no that same connection that Israel has created between religion, Judaism, and the idea that you have to turn it into a political ideology and connect it to a particular land. People have a separate idea of who they are as Jews who live, and they're part of cultures and societies and peoples and countries all over the world and been contributing massively everywhere. The idea that you have to think about only place that they can have that Jewish majority and force it is kind of, it is disastrous to this whole notion of people who are part and parcel of their societies, and yet you want to create a notion that no, this is where we want you to be. So I think that people are rejecting more than ever the idea that you can create facts on the ground and you can convince the rest of the world that this is the right thing to do, when the opposite is happening. There are more fatalities and more people paying for their lives. Unfortunately, the ratio is that more Palestinians are killed than Israelis. I think that there should be no killings, no Palestinians and no Israelis. I think that what we're seeing in Gaza is the fact that people are saying the Israelis are seeing the mirror. They're seeing the reminder of what happened in 48, and they can't take it, because the idea of the country was the idea that no, we are righteous. We were the victims, and we continue to be the victims. Yes, the Jews who came to Israel were the victims, particularly the ones who survived the Holocaust. But you cannot create another catastrophe for the sake of supporting victims of the Holocaust. The idea that you can be in a place where you constantly will fortify the place and militarize it and turn it and control other people for the sake of the minority in that land is not going to be sustainable. That is why people are saying it is going to be either going to be a full apartheid state, and the recent legislation that we've seen from the Israeli Knesset suggested going in that direction, or you're going to see a notion of the alternative, which is more humane, makes more sense. That is that opening up the conversation to equality for all. That we can look back at the history. We can say, yes, I would want to make sure that my history is there, and there's a connection to the Jews who live in Israel. There's a connection that they made with that place, and I think we should not deny that, and we should be working on that. And we should not be saying, oh, the people who live there have no rights whatsoever. That is not what I think most people who are really thinking thoughtfully and in a way that will be consistent with these principles that we talk about, equality and dignity for all, really thinking about how can we make this place a better place for all of us. And I think it's not impossible, because the impossible is now, because it's turning into this fear-mongering all the time, that if you just allow the Palestinian refugees to go back, then we will be massacred, just like in 1929 or what happened in Hebron. This is the kind of thing that we hear. You hear that people are raised on fear in Israel, which is really, really devastating. They're raised on serving the country by going to the army for 3 years to control other people. And you have a brave people who are saying, stop that. This is insane. We are not going to let ourselves to serve first in the occupation and then 67. Groups like Breaking the Silence, or groups like who are exposing the crimes that are happening in West Bank. These are the future partners for real living together. Now it's very difficult for anyone in Israel to talk about one-state solution or let's just bring all the refugees back, because the idea is that they're not seeing the humanity of the Palestinians, which is the very first thing to do. If you keep demonizing them, it's much easier for the rest of the country. And that's why the Gaza war, more than 95% of Israeli Jews supported the Israeli attacks on Gaza. Because there was this notion that no, their lives don't matter, they don't count, we can do anything for them in order to protect our normal life in Tel Aviv and in Jerusalem, and we are the country that we can do that, and we can remain democratic, and we can remain humane, and we can project that as the only Middle East democracy. No, that is not going to be sustainable. And I think that we're seeing the shift in public opinion in the United States, where even progressive or liberal Democrats, particularly among the young, who are seeing, they have a different relationship towards Israel, they are more sympathizing with the Palestinians, because they're seeing reality. And they're seeing that if they stand for equal rights here, if they stand for social justice here, if they stand for all the things that we are working as people who care about our future in this country, they are the same issues that
I just wanted to address the just the last question about so with what do we do with Christian evangelicals, and of course everything's happening in this country now, just very much going in the wrong direction. We can all just sort of universally say. And I would definitely agree with that. But I think we should recognize that things have been going in the wrong direction for about 500-600 years. And so that's where it's been going, right? And it's not just going in the wrong direction in regards to our policies on Palestine, right, or our policies on just with Trump or just with immigration. It's just going in the wrong direction with basically everything, And so I think that if we're going to start, addressing the way that, things are going very much in the wrong direction with our policies towards, Palestine and Palestinians and UNRWA and how we're defunding it, and we have, Trump is just, we could say so much about him, but I think we need to start understanding that I don't think we can just start analyzing it with Trump and the current situation, because the things are this way really because they're kind of built to be this way in this country. It's not just kind of an accident that Trump was, quote unquote elected, or it's not just an accident that we've supported Israel this long, or that we have, Christian, Zionists that, just sort of do these, things and support Israel and have, these racist ideologies. It's because it's kind of just built into the fabric and structures of this country when it's founded on genocide, right? And so we have to start there, and it's founded on slavery and the backs of slaves, and then founded on the genocide of indigenous peoples, and it's still founded on slave labor with prison labor and the prison strike that just happened that called that out, and which is legalized slavery, and it's still founded on legalized apartheid with the way that our neighborhoods are built and the way that our children are treated and the way that education systems are run and healthcare. And so we just it's not an accident, and I think that if we're going to really start addressing these things, we have to start looking further back and addressing things as a holistic system, because it's not just that our country is very anti Palestine and Palestinians, which it is, but I think it's very much a white supremacist capitalist system, and I think it's very much targeting Palestinians, but it's sort of like Palestinians are in the sort of this giant missile, and Palestinians are definitely in the way of this giant missile, as are many other black and brown indigenous people, and whoever gets in the way of this giant racist money-making war machine. So I think that's a larger picture.
I know we have to end. I just want to say one little statement about organizing. So I'm living in Miami now, so I'm part of Florida. I'm in Florida, and a lot of people are like, what? Is there any social justice movement in Florida? And I just want to talk about it for 1 minute, because I think it's really says a lot. It's unbelievable, the social justice organizing going on in Florida. And what's interesting is groups like the Dream Defenders and the Florida Immigrant Coalition and prison abolition groups and groups for justice in Palestine really have come together. And there's not this distinction between the domestic and the global, because it's seen so much as interconnected. And so bringing up Palestine, people have asked us to do workshops on the Nakba, and who have really wanted to be learning more. So I just want to say, with everything we're up against, and not to minimize that, but the power of the organizing. And the only other thing I wanted to say to that, because I know for many of us, we think about where and how we can have an impact. I think there's so many different ways. I am claustrophobic. I can't do certain things. I used to feel like I felt like, oh my gosh, I'm the worst activist ever. I'm claustrophobic. And then I realized there's lots of ways you can get involved, and we all have different ways we can bring our strengths to this movement, and that's the movement that's also, I don't want to leave out the word of the love, because we began this panel with how those of us who work together, what it means to have these relationships we build together. So I just wanted to say that it's not just a little add-on, it is so deeply meaningful, and I think helps sustain and propel the work that we're doing. So.
On that very important note, with love, I want to thank all of the speakers tonight. I want to thank Naomi and Charlotte. I want to thank Brooklyn for peace. I want to encourage all of you to keep on talking, keep on raising these issues, keep on going into the streets, keep on organizing, and there is always hope. Thank you.